Hello, I'm Stephen Pinker, Professor of Psychology at Harvard University, and I'd like to welcome you to Reimagining Victory, a series from the Imperial War Museum marking the 75th anniversary of VE Day this year. In fact, this year we are celebrating two things. We are celebrating the end of World War II, the most violent event in human history, with 15 million deaths on the battlefield and probably 55 million deaths overall. But we are also commemorating the non-occurrence of World War III, which was by no means a foregone conclusion. The title of my talk is The Thoughts About the Last World War, and the ambiguity in that title is deliberate. That World War II would be the last World War was by no means a foregone conclusion. In 1950, when the ashes of the destroyed cities were still warm, the great historian Arnold Toynbee wrote, "In our recent Western history, war has been following war in an ascending order of intensity. And today it is already apparent that the war of 1935 to 1945 was not the climax of this crescendo movement." And almost 30 years later, during the height of the Cold War, the great international relations theorist Hans Morgenthau wrote, "The world is moving ineluctably toward a third world war and strategic nuclear war. I do not believe that anything can be done to prevent it." Well, we are speaking on the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And what we can say is so far so good. To appreciate what has happened to the trajectory of war, it's worth it to revisit the history of war. I like to tell stories in graphs, and so I will present a number of graphs on what has happened in great power war, that is war between the 800-pound gorillas on the world stage, over the last half millennium or so. This first graph plots the percentage of time that the great powers were at each other's throats, at war with each other, in each 25-year period from 1500 to 2015. And what it shows is that several hundred years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war with each other, but more recently, they have never been at war with each other. The last great power war pitted the United States against China and Korea in 1953. But let's unpack that trend, which simply shows percentage of years that the great powers were at war. This next graph shows that over the last 500 years, wars involving a great power have become less common. The graph after that shows that wars involving a great power have become shorter. There used to be things like the 30 Years' War, the 80 Years' War, the 100 Years' War. The 20th century saw the Six-Day War. Unfortunately, there was a trend over the last several hundred years that went in the opposite direction to the declining frequency and duration of war, which is that as armies got larger, better organized, and better armed, the deadliness of wars involving a great power, that is, how many people could the great powers kill per country per year, increased until 1945, when that too did a U-turn. And so we've been living through a period in history in which great power wars have becoming less frequent and shorter and less deadly. If you combine all three of those trends and look at the overall death toll from great power wars over the last half millennium, you see that there are some big ups and downs, but the last 25-year period in the 20th century was actually the safest period for human lives lost in war for half a millennium. Let's unpack what happened in the 20th century and plot year by year the per capita death rate in war. And what you can see is that there are two unmistakably horrific spikes in bloodletting corresponding to the First and Second World Wars. But if we zoom in on the period after World War II, we see a remarkable development, which is that the rate of death in wars, and here this graph shows the death toll from all wars combined, not just the great power wars, but also the civil wars and the wars among not so great powers. And there are some sickening ups and downs. There are peaks for the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Iran-Iraq War, and most recently the Syrian Civil War. But the overall trajectory is unmistakably downward. Now, this overall historical development has been called the Long Peace, and it refers to the fact that since 1945, there's been a historically unusual decline in, particularly in interstate war, that is, wars between countries. The most salient number that characterizes the Long Peace is 0. That over the last 75 years, there have been no wars between the United States and its biggest rival, the Soviet Union and then Russia. Contrary to predictions from Toynbee and Morgenthau and many others, no nuclear weapon has been used in war since Nagasaki. There have been no wars between any two great powers since the Korean War. No wars between any two Western European countries, a fact that we are apt to take for granted, but which is historically extraordinary. Before 1945, Western nations alone fought about 2 wars a year for 600 years. After 1945, that went to 0. A person born since then is apt to think, well, of course, France and Germany would never fight a war against each other, but of course that is a historically recent development. And there have been no wars between developed countries since 1945. We tend to think of wars now as conflicts that take place in poorer and southern parts of the world. But for most of human history, it was the rich nations that were at each other's throats. And because rich countries can afford big armies, the wars they fought did a lot of damage. Why then does it seem like there have been so many wars since 1945? Having written about the decline of war in 2 books, The Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now, I know that this claim is met with incredulity. People simply can't believe it, given the number of wars that they read about in the news. The reason is that even though interstate wars have been declining, that is, 2 nations meet on the battlefield or in naval conflagrations and send their heavy weapons against each other, there have been more civil wars since World War II, as newly independent states with inept governments fought off insurgent movements, both sides stoked during the Cold War by the Soviet Union and the United States. But after the Cold War, the civil wars declined as well. There was a sickening uptick after the Arab Spring, particularly with the Syrian civil war, but that too is on the way down. This graph shows the trajectory of all wars since 1945. The red line shows the total of wars between countries and wars within countries. And it shows that even the uptick after the Arab Spring is starting to come down. The green line shows the number of interstate wars, and here the line has been pinned to 0 since 2003, the American and British-led invasion of Iraq. Still, civil wars, as horrible as they are, kill fewer people than interstate wars, and civil wars have been declining as well. Indeed, the agreement in 2016 between the government of Colombia and the FARC guerrillas marked the end of the last war in the Western Hemisphere and the last battle in the Cold War. Well, this all raises the question, what caused the long peace? What went right? Why has the last World War, at least so far, been the last World War? 3 hypotheses were advanced several hundred years ago by Immanuel Kant in his essay Perpetual Peace, in which he suggested that 3 factors disincentivized countries from going to war. One was democracy. It's all too easy for autocrats to fight wars for glory and preeminence and stroking their own egos, but when the cannon fodder have a say in decisions to go to war, they should have colder feet. International trade, if it's cheaper to buy things than to steal them, then countries will be less tempted to plunder. You don't kill your customers, you don't kill your debtors. And the third is an international community, organizations that bring states together in a kind of club or community where it's just considered not something that civilized people do to fight each other in wars. Now, several hundred years later, Bruce Russett and John O'Neill showed that all three of those factors indeed increased in the second half of the 20th century, and all of them are statistical predictors of peace. To see it in graphic terms, here we have a graph showing the relative prevalence of democracies and autocracies in the world over the last couple of hundred years. And despite the recent threats to democracy from Russia, Turkey, Hungary, and indeed the United States, the past decade still is the most democratic in human history, despite a bit of backsliding. International trade skyrocketed after 1945, and the membership in intergovernmental organizations increased as well. Perhaps most significantly, among those intergovernmental organizations were peacekeeping forces, and both the number of peacekeeping operations and the number of peacekeepers increased substantially after World War II, and even more so after the end of the Cold War. But in addition to these three factors, sometimes called the contributors to the Kantian peace or the liberal peace, there have also been changes in international laws and norms. The cliche about war from von Clausewitz for 150 years was that war was the continuation of policy by other means. That is no longer the case. War is literally illegal, except in self-defense or with the approval of the United Nations Security Council. Of course, there have been violations of that policy, but there are violations of every law, including laws against murder. Nonetheless, no one would deny that laws against murder are important in keeping the peace. War is no longer a legitimate option among respectable nation states. It is no longer true that if one nation has a grievance against another, such as an unpaid debt, it can bite off a chunk of territory as compensation and expect the global community to recognize the annexation. States are immortal. They may not be conquered, and indeed, since the end of World War II, no member of the United Nations has gone out of existence through conquest, a historically unprecedented event. And for better or worse, mostly better, borders are grandfathered in, no matter how irrational or arbitrary an interstate border is, they are now treated as sacrosanct. And perhaps most significantly, there's been a change in our attitudes toward war. In the literature on war prior to World War II, war was depicted as heroic, glorious, thrilling, manly, spiritual, holy. Afterwards, it's more likely that war was depicted as stupid, wasteful, repulsive, and cruel. Now, needless to say, these changes in laws, norms, and attitudes are in great part a response to the horrors of the two world wars. They began after World War I and picked up momentum after World War II. Well, this brings me to the question that forms the deliberately ambiguous title of my talk: will the last World War be the last World War? Or another way of putting it is, were Bob Dylan, Peter, Paul, and Mary, John and Yoko, and the cast of Hair right in encouraging us to dream that the world might someday put an end to war? Now, you might say the answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind, but I'm going to take it up as the conclusion of this talk. Now, thoughts of the end of interstate war, putting aside civil war, which is much harder to end because all it takes is a militia with who can get their hands on automatic weapons, which sadly is all too easy for someone to start a civil war. But when it comes to the club of nation states, 193 members of the United Nations, the idea that interstate war might vanish is not insanely romantic. The history of violence tells us that some barbaric customs, once abolished, pretty much stay abolished. For example, human sacrifice. Here we are in the middle of a pandemic, and no one suggests that we throw a virgin into a volcano or to perpetrate genocide against some religious minority in order to punish them for their perfidy or placate an angry god. Cannibalism, formal dueling among men of honor, eunuchism, heretic burning, chattel slavery, debtors' prisons, public torture executions, or the old pastime of taking the family out for an afternoon of wholesome fun by visiting an insane asylum and laughing at the antics of the insane. It's not that these customs can't be found anywhere on the planet. It's not that it's impossible that they return, that they could return, but it is a pretty good bet that they will stay abolished. Which raises the question, could major interstate war be next? Could it go the way of cannibalism, eunuchism, and human sacrifice? The answer, of course, is not necessarily, because some of the contributors to the long peace are indeed threatened today. They include democracy and international trade and international laws and institutions, and for that matter, the relative value placed on national greatness versus human flourishing. These threats are all the more reason to remember why these values rose after 1945, after VE and VJ Day, in the aftermath of the most violent event in human history. They are all the more reason to keep memories of World War II alive, not just for the gruesome fascination of war, but to ensure that the last World War is the last World War. Thank you.